Well, I want to welcome you to the world-famous Sail Power and Steam Museum of South Rockland, South Rockland's finest maritime museum and the home of the motor vessel Rekord, wonderful flagship. When I was 75 years old, that must have been 100 years ago, I bought this fantastic piece of property steeped in history right here on the south end. Hallowed grounds here, the old Snow shipyard where they built so many vessels back in the 19th century. In late 1800s, Rockland was the fourth largest seaport in the United States. Here they built these vessels, not the 6 or 7 masted picket fence schooners, but the 2, 3, and 4 masted vessels that carried the commerce of built this great nation. Little vessels that were pickup trucks of the 19th century. Every time you see an 18-wheeler or a USP truck, that was a sailing vessel. This property is certainly steeped in history. I could go on ad infinitum about the vessels built here, the fantastic vessels launched here and sailed here. Summer and winter, these vessels were sailing out there no matter what the weather was. They would get out there and deliver the cargo. But I'm not going to dwell on that now. Instead, I want to tell you far more about the old Rekord, and you'll just have to come and see some of the fantastic displays we have here. Look at the profile of this wonderful, cunning little vessel, the old freight boat Rekord, a Norwegian freight boat built in 1914 in Norway. My goodness, is she gorgeous. She is so unusual. A very different kind of vessel, a wooden vessel. I never could saddle up to a steel vessel or a fiberglass vessel, but you take an old wooden vessel and I go out of my gourd. Wonderful old boat like this, I just love to keep in my mantle at home. She was built in 1914 in Vestnes, Norway, built right on the beach, right out in the open there, where everybody could see her being put together. She had a single-cylinder Brundle chug engine in her. She was only 42 feet long, and she was built to carry farm goods from the farms in the fjords around Ålesund, Norway. She would bring the milk and goods back to the farmers' market all the time. A very handsome little vessel, but only 42 feet long. Here's her first profile. You can see her steaming along there, headed out to the islands, and she would go and pick up and do her freighting back and forth and back and forth. But in 1934, after being in service there for 20 years, she was a little small for her trade. The trade kept getting more and more, larger and larger, and needed a bigger vessel. So they cut her in half right down the middle. And they lengthened her out 3 meters. They lengthened her out just 9 feet and built her all back up again. Here's her second profile. You can see her steaming along there. You can see the uniformed crew on the foredeck. She was quite something back in those days. She had a little plume of smoke coming out her stack right there in the pilot house. That's to keep the pilot warm up there in the wintertime. It was a very nice vessel. They had accommodation in her there. They take passengers back and forth. Well, in 1954, she was again too small for her trade, so they decided they knew how to do it, and she still had a lot of goodness left in her. They cut her in half again. Another 3 meters. They lengthened her out another 9 feet and put up an upper deck on her, and this was her profile. And at that time, she was recertified at that time for 98 passengers. 98 passengers by the Board of Trade in Norway. Incredible vessel. Where would they put 98 passengers on that vessel? Well, they did anyway, and there they are right there at a May Day festival, and a whole crowd of people. You'd think the poor old thing would sink down under the weight of all those people on board, but she didn't. A fantastic little vessel, the Rekord, and very comfortable little vessel. Down in the engine room, you can see these 2 great big white jugs, 2-cylinder semi-diesel. She starts on air, rolls on air, and then has a glow plug that keeps her going for the first few revolutions. Then, like a Swiss watch, she ticks them off. During the war, she ran day and night for 4 years. She ran 26 days across the Atlantic when she was delivered over to the Caribbean. Runs and runs and runs. Mr. Brundle says she won't stop for you. Well, I hope you could hear that engine running. It's such a sweet sound. That engine has a personality all its own. Well, changing times. I became more and more enamored by tugboating. I ran the old Rekord for 4 or 5 years on the coast of Maine, delivering coal and doing other jobs with her. Wanted to get a towboat. Well, I sold the Rekord, and strange things happened. I sold her first down to a man who was going to take it over to the Great Lakes. He got as far as Albany. His wife said, "It's either me or the boat, mister, and I'm leaving." So the vessel was left there in Albany for half a year, all summer, no one attending it. And eventually, they called me. They found out because there was a paper in there that I must have owned the boat at one time. So I sold her a second time to a man down in Newport. He took care of her for about 10 years and fixed her up a bit. And then she was sold to a man from England, a Brit who decided he was going to change her all over and use her for Northwest Passage. Well, his plans failed, and he got in touch with me. And this is her pilot house, by the way. Her pilot house is very original, even has a speaking tube down to the engine room, and all of the instrumentation in Norwegian. An amazing vessel, the Rekord. She's so original, both in her profile now, as well as in her machinery and all of her accoutrements. So when our British friend had lost his courage, he had already gutted her out. He had taken all the accommodation out of her inside and taken the engine out. Called old Mr. Runville to rebuild it. Old Mr. Runville came over and said, "Well, it does not need to be rebuilt. The motor is good, and it will last a long time as yet." So he didn't know exactly what he would do with the vessel, but decided to donate it to the use of the Treasure Coast Museum in Stuart, Florida. And I happen to know Marge Pratt down there. She called me up and asked if my wife and I would go to work and bring the vessel down to Stuart for the Treasure Coast Museum, and they would use it as their museum ship. So of course I said that would be wonderful. I would just love to do that because the Rekord is such an interesting boat to run. The Rekord also is an interesting boat because she belongs to the World Ship Trust Association. That blue flag at her masthead with all her flags flying there is evidence of that facility, that organization. The World Ship Trust recognizes vessels that are worthy of salvation. She's the smallest of a fleet of wonderful big vessels like the Constitution and so on that are worthy of preservation. So anyway, my wife and I got ourselves together and we decided we would take this trip south with the Rekord. We went through 3 hurricanes. Wind blew like the devil. We tied up with 18 lines down in Norfolk when that hurricane went through there. At the same time, we were running the Maine down the Mississippi, so we had our hands full at that time. We had to be very careful running the Rekord down the inland waterway. When we got down into Florida particularly, it was very, very slim pickings as far as water goes. Here she is with her flags flying when we arrived down in Stuart, Florida. We tied her up to the dock, put our lines out, and she was aground. We didn't even have to put our lines out. She was aground. We ran her down there for the museum like this for a number of years, 4 years, and then the museum failed. Here she is laying at the dock just outside of Stuart. Well, when the museum failed, it was too bad. Our Waterway Times had an article about it, and our volunteer crew there. I kissed my wife when I told the owner that I would take the boat back north again. Kissed my wife goodbye, and we got her put together on the high run of the tide. We went out from Stuart, bouncing our way across outside Manatee Pocket, across and out the inlet into the ocean so that we could head north again. Waving goodbye to all of our friends there, you can see the Rekord blowing some smoke out her stack. When the museum failed, the other gang that was down there had abused her and had her all out of tune. Took me quite a bit to get her tuned up again, but I finally did. Here we're headed north with our little Boston whaler towing astern so that we could get off the bottom here and there where we would run aground. The Rekord's engine always attracts porpoises. Teams of porpoises come from all over to hear the thump, thump, thump of that engine. We also had sails for her. There's her mainsail and jib. When you get a good breeze of wind, why, it would help her. We got her north, and we brought her into the north end of Rockland to give to the apprentice shop. She went through several different hands after that, they weren't able to manage the boat, but she was sold off 2 or 3 other times and finally donated to the Sail Power and Steam Museum. And we went down and started her up and brought her north, and here we are entering Rockland Harbor, right outside the Sail Power and Steam Museum property at Sharps Point South. Winter time approached and got a hold of us, and we had to keep her covered up to keep this winter snows off of her. But we restored her. We got her all fixed up until she was all varnished and painted, and that little round cabin back aft that I had put in, so beautiful, all of her varnish work had to be redone. I built this cabin back aft with the round curved glass windows. I bought 5 tugboat windows from Witty's Scrapyard down in Staten Island, and here's the inside in her saloon with that round cabin back aft. Wonderful varnished table, beautiful place on the afterdeck to enjoy your cocktail. The next winter we continued her restoration with a full cover over her, and she then became our flagship for the museum. We carried passengers on Rockland Harbor, as many as 30 or 35 passengers at a time. We also tried to use her for other things. We had special dinners for her in the beautiful galley that my wife had fixed up for her. This wonderful little vessel, we tried to raise some money for her preservation, realizing that being built in 1914, she's over 100 years old now. She deserves to be preserved. A member of the World Ship Trust Organization, along with the Constitution, the Cutty Sark, the Tovarish, all the big vessels, she is one of those worthy of preservation. Thank you for listening. Come see us at the Sail Power and Steam Museum in South Rockland. I'm Captain Jim Sharp, signing off.